Warm greetings. In this edition of the NADI conversation, we are here to talk about something very intrinsic to our lives, the food we eat, and how that is impacted and is going to be impacted by climate change. Obviously, what we eat, what we grow, depends on the water, depends on the soil, the quality of the soil, the temperatures, all of which are impacted by climate change, especially water. And in this episode of Nadi Conversations, I'm so happy to discuss this very fundamental subject, so fundamental to our lives, with two very important experts and who've been doing extremely interesting work and in this field. Um, I'm here to welcome Devin Creed. He's currently pursuing his PhD in South Asian history at Duke University. He studies history of food and famine in the 19th and 20th century South Asia. He's a Fulbright-Nehru project scholar, explores the historical development of food charity in India, focusing on how traditional practices adapt to Western humanitarianism and modern nutrition science. Welcome, Devin. Um, and I'm also very, very pleased to have Jonathan Keats. Jonathan is an artist, writer, experimental philosopher. His conceptually driven transdisciplinary projects explore all aspects of society, adapting methods from sciences and the humanities. Jonathan has exhibited and lectured at dozens of institutions worldwide. His conceptually driven transdisciplinary projects explore all aspects of society, adapting methods from the sciences and the humanities. He co-directs the Future Democracies Laboratory at San Jose State University in the US and the Consortium for Climate Adapted Cultural Heritage. So welcome, gentlemen. Welcome to both of you to this episode of the Nadi Conversation. I think we are here to discuss a very, very fundamental topic to our daily lives. And on behalf of the Asian Confluence, I really look forward to this conversation. I think I'll start with Devin, hand over to Devin to take this conversation forward. Over to you, Devin.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having us on the podcast. We're really excited to be here. So first, I want to start out with the Tasting Tomorrow project. And Jonathan, I was wondering if you could introduce the project in general, the theory behind it, and the various moving parts it's taking around the world right now.
Yes, well, thank you. And thank you for inviting me on this program. I have been exploring climate change in myriad ways for quite a while now, with the conviction that we need to think about infrastructure. And when we think about infrastructure, we need to think not only about bridges and tunnels, but also about soft infrastructure, about cultural infrastructure, and how that is affected as much when we look at the stresses and strains that are put on society as the climate changes. And when I think about that sort of infrastructure, I start thinking about food. Food is really essential in terms of how we think of ourselves and how we relate to each other as a community, because it's deeply embedded in our traditions, and also because it's active in terms of the way that it activates us when we come together in the kitchen or around the table. And when I think about food, I think about the ingredients, naturally, because without ingredients, you don't have much of a meal. And when I think about the ingredients, I start to get a little bit concerned, because the ingredients that go into your heritage cuisine are ingredients that have grown where you live for a very long time, maybe since time immemorial. And that's why they are so present in your life and why they are essential to the foods that you know. But those ingredients, by virtue of the changing climate, are unlikely to be growable or at least to be sustainable in the future as you have the stresses and strains that come about through water and food insecurity, and more generally as you start to look at changes in temperature and humidity. So that has led me to try to figure out what might allow for the essential qualities to persist, the qualities that are likely to make food taste and make food feel like what you had in the past, so that you are able still to maintain that sense of self, community, place, where the ingredients might be very different. And this is a process. It's a process that is inherently going to require a lot of thought, and that is not best undertaken when you have no opportunity really to reflect or information to be able to assimilate other ingredients. So I started to look at climate analog modeling as an approach, as a way in which to be able to start a process that might be a very long-term process, a process that will potentially put us in a better position in 25, 50, or even 100 years to begin that process now. So climate analog modeling is a method that uses climate models and assesses the projected climate for a location by mapping it onto other locations in the world. In other words, by finding where in the world today you can find the climate that you will experience in 50 or 100 years, it becomes a way for ecologists to be able to make predictions about changes in flora and fauna. So what I've been working on is the idea that we can use this as a way in which to learn about ingredients that are likely to grow where you live in 50 or 100 years, and equally important, to be able to connect with people who are familiar with those ingredients now in order to be able to incorporate those ingredients as alternatives to the ingredients that you'll no longer have access to potentially in 50 or 100 years, so that you can begin already to come up with the repository of recipes that will be available to you and to your community going forward. So this is a process that is really complex and challenging because so many ingredients are seemingly simple because you're used to them, but they're not simple at all to somebody who has never encountered them. So, for instance, in Tucson, Arizona, where I have been working on this project at the University of Arizona for several years, we were looking at a climate analog, or rather looking at how Tucson is a climate analog for the Burgos region in Spain, for the city of Burgos and that area of Spain. The reason why we were looking at this as an example is because both Tucson and Burgos are UNESCO cities of gastronomy, and we had a partnership with chefs in Burgos. So we were looking at how we might be able to take traditional recipes from Burgos and reimagine them using ingredients that Burgos will have available most likely in around 60 or 70 years, as opposed to those that people in Burgos are accustomed to now, and how they might be able to make the recipes that really matter to them. So we took olla podrida. It's a traditional Spanish dish that uses Spanish red beans. And Spanish red beans are unlikely, because of the water, because of a number of factors, are unlikely to grow in Burgos at that time. But there's another bean, a highly drought-adapted bean that's found in Tucson called the tepary bean. And so we started to investigate whether olla podrida could be made using tepary beans instead. And it worked. But what was really important was that tepary beans require very different treatment. If you don't treat them in the right way, if you don't cook them for long enough, you're going to get a really bad stomach ache or worse. So it's a good example of how not only is it about transfer of ingredients, but also of know-how to be able to make this transition. And I guess the final point that I'll make is that Huevo podrida made with temporary beans, it tastes different. It has a different texture. It's similar, but not the same. And we also experimented with alternatives for rice, using Sonoran wheat berries as an alternative, as a binder in the blood sausage. And again, it's similar, but not the same. And that's really important, not only because it's a cautionary tale for the future, but also because it is a cautionary tale that can resonate in the present. In other words, by tasting tomorrow, it can motivate us to mitigate. So this is a project that is about adaptation. How do we adapt to conditions that are likely, but also how do we motivate ourselves in the present to act in ways that don't bring us to the absolute extreme, that potentially lead us to act responsibly and to moderate the changes that are inevitable at this point, but that need not be as extreme as they might be.
Great, thank you so much for that, for laying out the project, Jonathan. Now I want to move to how Tasting Tomorrow has come to this part of the world, specifically to the hills of Northeast India. Could you talk a little bit about your relationship and Tasting Tomorrow's relationship with Nagaland? And then I'll speak a bit about some work I've done there and some experiences I've had with Tasting Tomorrow in Nagaland.
Well, it's a long, convoluted story, and I'll spare you the details, but I was looking for climate analogs for Tucson and was interested in a region of Pakistan, Lahore, in terms of that being identified by our partners at the University of Maryland, at the Climate Science Center there, Matt Fitzpatrick and his colleagues, that using their modeling, we had identified that as a climate analog for Tucson. And so, in other words, Tucson in the future is expected to have the climate that is currently found in Lahore. So, trying to find someone who might be able to help us to understand the ingredients there and how to use them in the same way that we were doing, where we were looking to Burgos with ingredients from Tucson. I ended up through a colleague who's an archaeologist in Australia, posting to a web posting online. I can't remember where she posted, and hearing from Nagaland, hearing from the director of the Highland Institute in Nagaland, who told me he didn't know anything about Lahore, didn't know anybody there, but Nagaland is a pretty interesting place, and would I be interested in bringing the project to Nagaland? So, without giving up on the project of finding someone in Lahore, I immediately became interested in Nagaland and what we might be able to do working with the Highland Institute. And so I was introduced to a number of young anthropologists who have been working there on foodways and became thoroughly enamored and somewhat knowledgeable, not really, but I'm trying, about this region that I very much hope to visit. And it's become an extraordinary experience in terms of being able to take this project and really expand the people participating in terms of their perspectives, and also the range of locations and what we can learn, not only directly what we can learn from each other in terms of ingredients, but we can learn at that meta level in terms of methodology, in terms of how to go about this sort of transformation, this sort of process of preparation.
Great. And this is how I got involved in the project, and how I met Jonathan was through the Highland Institute in Kohima. So I was able to go there in November of last year to meet all these anthropologists who are working on foodways and to organize a workshop with them where we were using the climate analog for Nagaland, which we have identified as the Lower Deer District in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan, which is a mountain district in northern Pakistan. And we have tried to introduce some of the commonly grown crops there and to try to replace those items with common foodstuffs used in Naga cuisine. Now, Naga cuisine is very varied because the state is made up of 16 tribal communities, and they all have very specific foodways, and they use different ingredients, and it's really hard to pin down foods that are common to the whole area. But we tried to work with people in Kohima, the capital of the state, which is people from all over the state live there, but the Ao community are the native people to that part of the state. So we looked at some typical dishes there, and we tried to make some substitutions at this workshop. So we cooked a bunch of food, and then we had people come to the workshop. They tried it, and we asked them questions about what they had eaten and about what they saw as the changes in foodways in the state. So the main substitution we tried to make was to use the black-eyed pea in place of the soya bean. The soya bean is ubiquitous in Nagaland, as it is in much of hilly South Asia and Southeast Asia. And it's used in many Naga preparations, particularly in one of the most famous foods from the region, Akone, which is a fermented soybean preparation, not unlike various fermented soybean preparations from Eastern Asia, like doenjang, miso, and there's also various Chinese fermented soybeans as well. So what we did is we just swapped out the soybean, and we cooked a kolar dish from Eastern Nagaland. We made a chutney where we replaced soybeans with black-eyed peas, and we also made some substitutions, like using jalapenos in place of more standard bell peppers. We've also tried reintroducing millets into diets. These used to be common in Nagaland, but they were kind of forced out when Christian missionaries came to the area, and they were really not pleased with the beer that was made from these millets. So millets have kind of died out. But these are the kinds of things that we're taking from Lower Deer District and reintroducing in a small way at these workshops, and try to figure out how people feel about these substitutions. And most interestingly, in recent months, the anthropologists at the Highland Institute have been making a film about Akone, and they've tried an experiment by making Akone out of black-eyed pea instead of soybean. I also tried this experiment in my home in Kolkata, but it went horribly wrong because I did not seal things properly, and I really only ended up creating a maggot colony rather than a new and exciting fermentation experiment. But I'll be trying again later. So what we found when we served these dishes to people is that people were very receptive to these new ingredients. They incorporated well into these traditional dishes, and some people preferred the traditional beans that we were substituting out the black-eyed peas for. But what's important to note is that when we talk to people in Kohima, that foodways have been changing a whole lot in recent years in the 21st century, and that tastes and the way people eat and who people eat with has been changing a whole lot, especially among the younger generations in the state. So I want to talk a bit about the history of food in this hilly region of Northeast India, Southeast Asia, talk about why I got so excited in this project and how it fits into things I'm interested in as a food historian of this region. So, Jonathan, feel free to jump in at any point here. But I'm going to talk a little bit about food history and recent developments in this region and how they inform our thinking about how climate change is really going to change the way people eat in this region in the future. So feel free to jump in at any point.
I'm delighted to be here learning from you. So please go ahead.
Okay. So as a food historian of South Asia, I generally deal with the 19th and 20th century. But when I saw this project, I got very, very excited because changes in foodways are very much a historical story. And even though climate change is something we think about as it's happening in the future, it is happening right now, and it has happened in the past, and it has dramatically changed the way people eat. And I primarily study the way that famine has changed the way people eat. And famine is often due to various climatic changes and shifts and the way that rainfall patterns have changed, and the way that rivers have changed their course and affected agricultural land in this part of the world. So I very much see climate change as another element that food historians have to think about when we're thinking about the ways that food and foodways are going to change in this part of the world. So what do food historians study? There are a myriad of different things, but I want to look at five big ones, 5 ways to categorize how we think about food. We could think about food production. That's how the food is grown and produced, or perhaps not in an agricultural setting, but in a natural setting. Then we think about food distribution. How does the grown food or the naturally produced food, how does it get to where people can buy it and turn it into something else? We also think about food preparation. That's cooking, culinary techniques, various traditional ways of dealing with ingredients that have been passed down through generations, and then innovations in culinary techniques and changes. Then we think about consumption. This is probably the most popular category that food historians think about, because the way people eat has a lot to do with identity, has a lot to do about the way people think about themselves and present themselves in the world. And then finally, we think about the disposal of food. Where does food waste go? How does food waste get recycled back into the ecosystem? How do we prepare for the next round of producing food through manure and garbage disposal and whatnot? And climate change touches on all of these things. So if we want to think about the food and the food history of this hilly part of Northeast India and Southeast Asia, I want to point out some commonalities among the food habits in this region. And then I'll talk a little bit about the food production and how climate change is changing these things. So first, rice binds all these regions together. Rice is the carbohydrate of choice in the hills, and almost all peoples in Northeast India are eating rice as their main carbohydrate. As opposed to in the plains of South Asia, people are more likely to eat wheat or millets. Non-veg food is also very popular here. All different kinds of meats, like domesticated meats, but also wild meats. And in Nagaland, you'll find people eating all sorts of things, insects, snails, frogs, all sorts of things that people in the plains would not eat. We also have an emphasis on preservation, various different preservation techniques. The most important being fermentation, and you'll see fermented foods all over Northeast Asia, as well as in China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Smoking is also very important here, particularly for preserving meat. And we also have various different ways of drying by hanging it. Usually this is fish. People are hanging fish up and letting it dry in the wind. And this is turned into various different dishes based on rehydrating the fish to certain degrees. Another commonality is that the vast panoply of spices that are used in the plains of South Asia are often not used in the hills, but that doesn't mean the dishes are not flavorful. They're often very flavorful and very strong because fermentation imparts strong flavors to food, as well as smoking and drying. And then some very fragrant herbs and chilies are often used in the foods here. Now, these commonalities of food preparation and consumption, these developed out of what the land gives. People eat rice because you can grow rice in the hills through terrace paddy farming. People ferment things because they've had to. Refrigeration is a relatively new invention, and for the longest time, the best way to preserve things was through fermentation, smoking, or drying. People eat so many different meats and non-veg food items because hunting and foraging have been a very important part of the foodways in this part of the world. So those are the commonalities that bind the region together. And it's also important to note that the biggest historical change that made a massive shift in how people eat in South Asia is European colonization and the Columbian exchange. Basically, various European colonizers brought over foods from the Americas that were introduced and then became quite popular in this part of the world. However, these foods are not as popular in hilly regions. Prominent New World foods that are used in these hilly regions are tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, and corn. But these foodways have not shifted as much compared to the plains parts of the subcontinent after the Columbian Exchange. And that's because the emphasis has always been more on locally cultivated and locally naturally occurring foodstuffs than imported foodstuffs. However, recent changes in the region have shifted all of that. Northeast India has primarily been an agricultural land, and the majority of the population relies on agriculture for their livelihood. But today, many states in Northeast India are net food importers because the government of India has been pushing various cash crops, especially oil palm plantations, in recent years. Just last year, the central government passed the Forest Conservation Amendment Act, and it's claimed all community-owned forest lands within 100 kilometers of the border. They are now available for use by the government for national security purposes. Now, many of these forest areas, which are in the states of Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram, many of these have been community-used owned forests that various peoples have used to forage. They've cultivated crops there as well on a cyclical basis. And now these are being converted into oil palm plantations. And various other parts of these border states have also been changed over to cash crops. And that's why in recent years, many of these places have become food importers. And that's why many of the food habits have changed. The anthropologists at the Highland Institute, who we've been in dialogue with, they've been doing a lot of field work in border areas in Nagaland, and they found that the food habits, all the elderly people who live there have been saying that things are drastically changing. Food habits are changing, food availability is changing. And when you go to cities in the Northeast, you're going to find a lot of restaurants that cater towards different tastes. They're serving Chinese food, Korean food, North Indian food, and then you'll often not find traditional food from the hills in restaurants. This is usually reserved for home. So agriculture in the hills has also been quite distinctive and quite different from agriculture in the plains. Agriculture in the plains of South Asia has been very affected by the Green Revolution, which encouraged monocropping, various high-yield seeds to try to feed a part of the world that was growing drastically in population and is still growing. But in the hills, agriculture works much differently. Instead of monocropping, multiple crops are grown at the same time and often in the same fields. And instead of growing one crop for the whole season, the growing seasons are usually cyclical. People are starting with root crops. They're moving on to grains, such as rice, and then they're ending the growing season with vegetables. Geum agriculture, or slash and burn agriculture, is also quite popular, as well as foraging for herbs, roots, and vegetables. But all of this is changing due to new government regulations and cash crops coming to these parts of Northeast India. And all of this is also affecting climate change, and it is also constitutive of climate change. So let's talk a little bit about climate analogs for this part of the world and possibilities for thinking about the future of the climate in this part of the world. Do you want to jump in here, Jonathan?
Just to say that I think you made a really important point, and thank you for the general history and also for the broader context. I think that this is tremendously important, and I'm so excited to have you involved in this project for all those reasons, as well as for your imagination, your creativity. But I think that the point that you made about how there's effectively a feedback loop that is established where the foods that are no longer viable because of the demands that they place on the environment drive the conditions that make the environment even more hostile to those ingredients, and not only to those ingredients, but also to ingredients that might be similar to them, and not only to ingredients, but also to all the other life that lives in that region, the non-human life, as well as, of course, human life. So, in effect, both, I think, in terms of how we eat and also how we live. And this is another part of the larger project that I've been working on with a number of partners, ranging from partners in Nagaland to partners in Mexico City. We've also been looking at vernacular architecture and looking at how housing vernaculars are potentially, well, that they are very important in terms of how we live our lives, how we connect as families, how we connect as communities. But they also have thermodynamics to them, and those thermodynamics that were designed for past climates are unlikely to work in climates that are already those that we're experiencing, and certainly climates to come. And as a result, there's a tendency to turn on the air conditioning, but that only drives the conditions to an even greater extreme and makes the situation more untenable. So I think that in both food and in shelter, we're looking at similar circumstances. That is to say that that food and shelter sustain us. They are culturally and spiritually essential to who we are. And yet our attempt to sustain what we know and what nourishes us, literally and metaphorically, can have the effect of further exacerbating the problem and therefore further alienating us. And this is where the ways in which we consider adaptation are so important. And so much of that is the sort of work that you've been doing in Nagaland and our partners at the Highland Institute have been doing, and also the work that I've been doing just very recently on a trip to Mexico City, where I've been working with the Metropolitan Autonomous University, and where we're looking at Mexican cuisine in a similar way. And also looking at architecture in Mexico City. It's a process of trying to understand from people what's the essence of the food that makes it the food that they know. What's the essence of the house that makes it home? And this is something that only people who live in a given place and live with these foods and live in these homes that they are going to know, that they can tell us. So to try to bring that information out into the world, and then to be able reciprocally to provide alternatives in the sense not of forcing anything on anybody, but in the sense of providing options that might be ways in which to keep what is most important while recognizing what is no longer viable. To try to make that balancing act interactive, and to do so gradually, and to do so before we enter into a state of panic. Those are really the core motivations of Tasting Tomorrow, of climate adapted heritage cuisine, architectural heritage, and the broader climate adapted cultural heritage initiative that I've been involved in and had the honor of being able to work on with the Highland Institute and with people like you.
Great. I really like what you said about thinking about what is the essence of traditional foods. Like, what is it? Is it ingredients? Is it techniques? Is it that people are eating them together? And one of the things I was thinking about while preparing for this podcast is that in the hills, people have generally and traditionally relied on foraging. They've relied on seasonal vegetables. They've relied on things that are easily available to them. And given that we're probably going to see great changes in this part of the world due to climate change, and given that the Bengal Delta is going to be one of the places most affected by rising sea levels, we're definitely going to see changes in landscapes here, changes in the growing capacities of the land, and we're going to see changes in what kinds of vegetables and what kinds of herbs, what kinds of plants are going to grow. But I don't see a reason why people will not be able to adapt, given that foraging and using what is seasonal has been so essential to developing traditional cuisines here. And we've seen people being open to trying new legumes, new vegetables, new kinds of things. I don't see why adaptation cannot happen. But as you noted, there is going to be this great balance between real people. This great balance between the kind of necessity of change and the will to change.
Well, and
we want people.
I think what you brought up earlier about how the government is encouraging the use of ingredients that are monocrop, grown in bulk, and imported from elsewhere. I think that that's one of the key issues, because when you speak about foraging is essential not only for the foods foraged, but for the act of foraging itself. And the way in which people as a not as a social act in the sense of we're just socializing here, but as a social phenomenon, as a socializing phenomenon, that foraging has been essential to the culture. It's as important to sustain that as it is to sustain the flavors of the foods that are foraged. So understanding what is likely to grow in the region, not as a matter of agriculture in this case, not as a matter of what you could grow, but as a matter of what is likely to grow of its own accord. That's and how to use those ingredients, which starts with how to recognize them, which is really going to be a matter of having that direct line of communication with people in Pakistan and also other climate analog locations. That's, I think, one of the really exciting aspects of what we can achieve. I'm sorry, I cut you off, I think.
No, thank you very much, Jonathan and Devin, for that extremely illuminating deep dive into what you're doing, and I think all the points that you've brought out are extremely relevant. I must just say that one of the regions that Devin has brought up, which is the northeastern part of India, there is a huge amount of natural biodiversity, and what I think, in addition to growing bulk crops, which I don't think is very viable just because of the topology. What is happening is that there is a lot of focus on growing and aggregating the high value crops, such as the fruits and the vegetables, which are of a higher value and which can yield better value, basically. So there are policies in work. I don't think the palm oil is going to work. It's actually not been going much movement forward. But I would sort of take a few keywords from what you said, which is balance. I think balance is the need of the day. How do you preserve local lifestyles, the culture? At the same time, it's a globalized world. Everybody wants to taste different things. Everybody wants to try out new stuff. So how do we really balance the diversity of food and tastes that are available just by importing them as well as growing them? But I must say that the region does hold a lot of diversity in terms of what can grow. So that's been one of the strengths, I think. I look forward to sort of taking this conversation forward. And Asian Confluence has been, it's not only the Northeast region, but it's also the entire neighborhood. If you look at the geography, it's a Himalayas to Bay of Bengal. The entire spectrum of weather patterns, precipitation patterns are available. And that brings out huge prospects for complementarity. And I say this is almost a laboratory of the possibilities of what can happen, whether it's spices, whether it's foods, and whether it's lifestyles and architecture, which again, as you said, is an integral part of the whole weave of how people would deal with it, because one is linked to the other. But on that note, I think I would really like to take this opportunity to thank you both for coming on to this conversation. And we at the Asian Confluence, we would love to look forward to not only more such conversations, but some projects where we can actually take some ideas forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So viewers, on that note, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this video and the NADI Conversations series. Thank you.